The beginning of a long night. The night was cold, but the air in the car was stifling, thick with tension and an unnerving sweetness. Joy Carter sat in the passenger seat, her fingers curling into the leather upholstery, her heart racing. Ryan's driving was reckless, and despite the fun atmosphere he was trying to create, she could feel the unease building within her. Ryan had insisted on driving fast, weaving between lanes with a boldness that bordered on arrogance. She had laughed along with him at first, but now, with every jolt and sharp turn, her sense of discomfort deepened. Something wasn't right. "You okay?" Ryan asked, glancing at her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, just, slow down a little," Joy replied, trying to sound casual, though her voice trembled slightly. She was barely keeping her composure. The speed at which they were driving was unsettling, the car's tires squealing against the road with each curve. Ryan only laughed, an odd, almost forced sound. "Come on, live a little, Joy. You're way too serious." She wanted to tell him to stop, to take her back home, but she couldn't quite bring herself to say it. Her eyes darted nervously between him and the road. The city was strangely quiet that evening, and the winding street they were on seemed to stretch on forever with no signs of life. She had been excited for their date, anticipating the nice dinner at the trendy restaurant they'd been talking about for weeks. But now, with Ryan pushing the car to its limits, the whole night felt off. The car jolted again, and this time Joy's hand flew to the seatbelt, gripping it tightly as Ryan swerved dangerously close to another car. Panic gripped her chest. She wasn't sure if it was his arrogance or his increasingly erratic behavior, but something had shifted. "Ryan, slow down," she pleaded, her voice cracking. But instead of heeding her words, Ryan seemed to accelerate even more. He grinned, his eyes gleaming with a wild energy. "Don't worry. I've got this." Joy's pulse thundered in her ears as the car zoomed faster, swerving left and right between lanes. The suddenness of his actions caught her off guard, but she tried to keep her cool. She'd heard rumors before, about Ryan's bravado, his need to impress, but she'd never seen it like this. "Ryan, seriously," she shouted, clutching the armrest. He didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, and there was something in the way his knuckles tightened around the steering wheel that made Joy's blood run cold. The car lurched again, and she could feel the tires fighting for control on the slick pavement. "You're crazy!" Joy cried out. Ryan didn't react. Instead, he glanced at her briefly, a strange look in his eyes. "It'll be fine," he muttered, his voice slurred just slightly. "Ryan?" Joy asked, her voice small, her heart pounding faster than she could breathe. But before she could say anything else, there was a sharp screech of tires. The car jerked violently as Ryan swerved, narrowly avoiding a truck. The world around Joy seemed to slow, everything coming into sharp, terrifying focus as she realized just how close they were to disaster. "Ryan," she screamed, her voice raw with panic. Before she could process what was happening, the car's front end slammed into the truck, and everything went black. When Joy opened her eyes, the world around her was a blur. She felt weightless, her body limp and unresponsive. The familiar scent of her home was gone, replaced by the sterile, metallic stench of a hospital room. The harsh fluorescent lights above her flickered and buzzed like a constant reminder of the chaos that had just unfolded. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. Pain surged through her as if her very bones had been shattered, each breath a struggle. Her mind, foggy and disoriented, scrambled for clarity. The accident. Ryan, was he okay? Joy. A soft voice called out to her, and she turned her head slightly to find a nurse standing beside her bed. She was a stranger, with kind eyes and a calming presence. "You're at the hospital, sweetheart," the nurse said gently. "You've been in a car accident, but we're taking good care of you." Joy blinked, trying to focus on the nurse's face. "Ryan?" she croaked, her throat dry and scratchy. The nurse's expression faltered, but only for a moment. He's in critical condition, sweetie. We're doing everything we can for him. Joy felt her heart drop, a cold fist wrapping around her chest. She wanted to cry, but her body refused to cooperate, too weak, too broken. Her mind reeled, the fractured pieces of the night's events flooding back. Ryan was driving too fast, she whispered to herself, the realization hitting her with a wave of nausea. The strange smell in the car, the way his hands had trembled on the wheel, it was all starting to make sense. He had been high. He had been driving under the influence. The nurse's hand gently rested on Joy's arm, a small comfort in the sea of chaos around her. We need to get in touch with your parents, okay, honey? Can you help us with that? But Joy's mind was elsewhere. Her father. Adam Carter. The legendary biker. The one person who could fix this, who could make everything better. I need to call my dad, she whispered, her voice breaking as the weight of the situation settled over her. The nurse nodded sympathetically, moving to the side to speak with someone outside the room. Joy closed her eyes, the pain in her body becoming a distant hum as the fog of sleep threatened to take over. She had no idea how long it had been, but the next time she opened her eyes, the room was different. The nurse was gone, replaced by a figure standing in the doorway, a tall man, broad-shouldered and imposing. His presence filled the doorway, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch out across the room. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized who it was. Adam Carter. Her father. He stood there, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. His eyes were locked on her, scanning her body with a mixture of concern and something else, something darker. Dad, she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't speak at first, just stepped into the room, his boots thudding heavily on the floor as he moved closer. His eyes, usually warm and comforting, were now sharp and focused. Where's Ryan? Joy asked, her voice trembling. Adam's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he didn't respond. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Dad, please, Joy pressed, panic rising in her chest. What happened? He finally spoke, his voice low and steady. Ryan. He's not going to make it. The words struck her like a physical blow, and she struggled to breathe as the weight of the news sank in. Ryan was gone. She didn't know how to process it, didn't know how to feel. She had just wanted to go on a normal date, to have a good time, and now. Adam's eyes softened as he reached out to touch her hand, his grip firm but gentle. I'm here now, sweetheart. I'm here. But as he held her hand, something else was stirring in him. A quiet fury that had been building ever since he had received the news of the accident. Something deep in the pit of his stomach was telling him that this wasn't just an accident. There was more to this than what the doctors had been saying, more than what the police were telling him. As he sat down beside her, his thoughts drifted back to a time before his reputation as a biker legend, a time when he had fought for justice in ways most people didn't understand. Joy's father was a man who commanded respect. And if there was one thing he knew for sure, it was that no one, hurt his family and got away with it. Rest now, he said to Joy, his voice softer now. I'll take care of everything. Just rest. But as he stood and moved toward the door, his eyes hardened once more. The hospital was about to learn that Adam Carter didn't take kindly to people who thought they could get away with hurting his own. What had started as a routine visit to the hospital would soon spiral into something much darker, much more dangerous, and it would set the stage for a battle that would shake this institution to its core. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The unseen enemy. The quiet of the hospital room felt suffocating. Even though Joy was surrounded by machines beeping softly and the occasional murmur of nurses moving in and out, there was a palpable stillness, a tension that clung to the air. She lay there, drifting in and out of a half-conscious stupor, her body bruised and battered, but her mind was far from still. Ryan. The word kept echoing in her thoughts, a relentless pounding that wouldn't let go. Her heart ached for him, for the boy she had trusted, the one who had turned out to be something altogether different, someone who had driven them both into disaster. As the haze of sleep ebbed away and the reality of the accident settled in, she could feel the panic rising again, threatening to consume her. Her father had arrived, and while his presence was comforting in some ways, it also set off something else within her, a deep dread that she couldn't place. Adam Carter wasn't just any father. He was a man of reputation, of power, of people who feared and respected him. And it wasn't just his status as a legendary biker that commanded attention. It was the ferocity with which he protected those he loved, a quality he'd passed on to his only daughter. Now, Joy could feel the weight of his protective instincts pressing down on her as the hours dragged by. He hadn't said much since his arrival, but his silence was more telling than any words could have been. Her father was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his voice was like a steel hammer, strong, definitive, and unforgiving. The nurses had kept coming and going, checking her vitals, administering more pain medication, but none of them seemed to notice the shift in the atmosphere as Adam remained at her side. His presence filled the room, his watchful eyes never leaving the door, as if he were expecting something to happen, something he couldn't put into words but was already anticipating. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to Joy's room opened again, and this time, it wasn't just a nurse or a doctor. It was Dr. Richard Calloway, the chief attending physician on her case. He walked in with the air of someone who was used to being in control, his steps purposeful, his white coat pristine, and his posture ramrod straight. He was a tall man, with sharp features that made him look almost as though he had been carved from stone. But as soon as he laid eyes on Adam, there was a slight flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Adam's gaze never wavered as the doctor approached. There was no greeting, no pleasantries, just the heavy silence between them. Dr. Calloway seemed to pause for a moment, as if sensing something he couldn't quite place. The silence stretched on, and it was only when Joy felt the thick tension in the air that she realized the doctor had no idea who her father was. "Miss Carter," Dr. Calloway said, his voice smooth, but there was an undercurrent of something Joy couldn't quite pin down. His eyes flicked to Adam briefly before focusing back on her. "How are you feeling?" "We've done everything we can, but I'm afraid there are still some concerns about your injuries." Joy wasn't listening to his words. She could see the doctor's movements, the way his eyes avoided her father's, like he was trying to keep his distance, trying to maintain control over a situation that he couldn't fully grasp. "I'm fine," Joy muttered, her voice hoarse from the strain of speaking. "Just want to get out of here." Dr. Calloway's lips twitched into a thin smile. He didn't answer immediately, but instead began scribbling on his clipboard, making notes of her vitals, her progress. He glanced at her injuries briefly, but the moment his eyes flicked back to Adam, the tension in the room thickened. There was something about the way he avoided meeting Adam's gaze that struck Joy as odd. Adam remained still, his jaw clenched, his posture unwavering. He wasn't looking at the doctor, but at something behind him, something that seemed to be stirring in the air, a presence that made the doctor uncomfortable, though he couldn't have known it. "Dr. Calloway," Adam's voice broke through the silence like a sharp blade. The doctor's hand faltered mid-scribble, and he looked up at Adam, his face betraying just a hint of surprise. "Yes." Dr. Calloway responded, his tone a little too polite, a little too rehearsed. "Why are you still here?" Adam asked, his voice low but with an edge that sent a ripple through the room. "My daughter's been through an accident, and she's not going to be your next experiment." The words hit Joy like a punch to the gut. She hadn't expected this. Her father's protective instinct was sharp, but the venom in his tone made the air crackle with hostility. Dr. Calloway's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'm just doing my job," Dr. Calloway said, his voice tight but still professional. "I'm here to make sure your daughter is receiving the best care possible." "Oh, I'm sure you are," Adam shot back, his eyes narrowing. "But you're doing it in a way that's far from acceptable." Joy could feel the blood drain from her face as her father's words hung heavily in the air. What was happening? Why was her father so upset? She turned to look at the doctor, then back at Adam, trying to piece together the puzzle that seemed to be unraveling before her. Dr. Calloway's gaze flicked nervously to the door, almost as if he were waiting for someone, waiting for help, perhaps. He took a slow step back, clearing his throat before speaking again. "I think I'll leave you to rest for now," he said, his voice now coated with a thin layer of sarcasm. "We'll continue the tests, but I'll let the nurses take over for the time being." Adam didn't move as the doctor turned to leave. He didn't even acknowledge him with a glance. The door shut softly behind Calloway, and only then did Adam allow his posture to loosen, though the anger still burned beneath the surface. Joy's pulse was racing as she tried to gather the fragments of what had just happened. "What did he mean by that?" she asked softly, looking at her father, confusion flooding her thoughts. Adam didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath, his eyes still cold as he stared at the closed door. "That man is not a healer, Joy," he said finally, his voice low. "He's part of a system that thinks they can do whatever they want, especially to people like us." Joy blinked, her mind still foggy from the accident. "What do you mean?" Her father turned to face her, his expression now serious, his tone darker. "I'm going to make sure that man never does what he did again. But it's not just him, sweetheart. It's the whole damn system. This hospital, this city, it's built on a foundation of privilege and racism. And they think they can get away with it." Joy's head spun with the weight of his words. She had no idea what her father was talking about. She had grown up sheltered, wrapped in a cocoon of wealth and security, far removed from the harsher realities of the world. But now, in the sterile confines of this hospital room, surrounded by machines and whispers, she began to understand that there were things going on here that she could not yet comprehend. "Are you going to do something about it?" Joy asked, her voice a little more firm now. Adam's gaze softened as he looked at his daughter, his protective instincts kicking in fully. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "But it won't be just me. We'll expose everything, Joy. Everything. The unraveling." Joy sat in her hospital bed, her eyes wide, as her father's words reverberated in her mind. It was hard to fully understand what he was saying, but the intensity in his voice left no room for doubt. Something was happening, something she wasn't yet able to grasp, but her father, as always, was ahead of the game. The tension in the room had only increased after Dr. Calloway left, and Adam had pulled up a chair beside her bed. He didn't speak immediately, but instead looked at the door, his expression unreadable. It was as if he were silently strategizing, his mind moving at 100 miles per hour. The feeling of powerlessness that Joy had experienced since the accident was starting to give way to something more dangerous, a rising suspicion that everything around her was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. "You're really upset," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, unsure of how to bridge the growing chasm between them. "What did he mean, Dad? About the system?" Adam let out a low sigh, his eyes softening as he turned to her. "It's not just about you, sweetheart. It's about a whole lot more than that. I've seen things in my time that most people couldn't even fathom. The world isn't as fair as we'd like to think it is, and that hospital," he gestured vaguely toward the closed door, "it's just one example of the kind of place that hides its ugliness beneath layers of professionalism." Joy's head swam with the implications of his words. Her father, a legendary figure in the biker world, was known for his unwavering loyalty to his family and crew. He had earned respect through sheer willpower and strength, but he was also no stranger to the darker side of life, places where money and influence governed more than integrity or compassion. "You think Dr. Calloway did something to me?" she asked hesitantly, not entirely sure if she was ready for the answer. Adam's gaze was hard, his eyes narrowing. "He's part of it. A symptom, not the cause. You think someone like him could get away with treating people like you and me any way he likes without there being a bigger picture?" No, sweetheart. This runs deep. And I'm going to make sure everyone sees it for what it is. But how? Joy whispered, feeling the weight of everything she didn't understand pressing down on her. How are you going to do that? Adam leaned in, his voice dropping lower as if sharing a secret. I've got friends. People who've been in this game for a long time. People who understand how systems work. They're not going to like what we expose, but I'm done staying quiet. You deserve better, Joy. You deserve better than that doctor, than that hospital, than a world that thinks it can walk all over you just because you don't fit their idea of acceptable. The words hit her like a sudden wave of realization. Her father wasn't just angry, he was calculating, determined to bring down the forces that had wronged her, even if she didn't fully understand what those forces were yet. She closed her eyes, overwhelmed by everything, the pain in her body, the confusion in her mind, and the sheer weight of the situation that was beginning to unfold around her. The hospital room, once a sterile place of healing, now felt like a battlefield, a place where an invisible war was being fought, and her father was preparing for the final assault. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft tap of footsteps on the floor, and the door to her room creaked open. Joy turned, expecting another nurse, but what she saw made her heart skip a beat. It was Officer Martinez, the police officer who had spoken to her earlier, along with another officer she didn't recognize. Joy's breath caught in her throat as the two men entered. Their expressions were unreadable, their eyes scanning the room before settling on her father. Adam's eyes hardened, his jaw tightening at the sight of the officers, but he didn't stand. Instead, he merely raised an eyebrow, his posture unflinching. Mr. Carter, Officer Martinez said, his tone professional but laced with a quiet tension. We're here to ask your daughter a few more questions. It's important that we get a full account of what happened tonight. Adam didn't move, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Is this necessary? He asked, his voice like ice. I already told the police what happened. Officer Martinez nodded, his voice steady. We understand, sir, but we're still working on piecing everything together. Your daughter's statement is crucial. We just need to get more details. For the record. Joy could see the undercurrent of tension, the subtle shift in the atmosphere that only her father seemed to be aware of. Something was off, but she couldn't pinpoint it. She glanced at her father, hoping for some indication of what was going on, but he just stared ahead, his face unreadable. I don't think she's in any condition to answer questions right now, Adam said coldly, his voice low but commanding. She's been through a lot, and I'm not going to let anyone pressure her while she's still recovering. The officers exchanged a brief look before Officer Martinez nodded slightly. We understand, Mr. Carter. But this investigation is important. You know how these things go. We just need to be thorough. Adam leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on the officers. I understand, he said, his voice dangerously calm. But I'm not sure you understand what you're walking into here. And I'm not going to let my daughter be used as a pawn in some game. The words hung in the air, sharp and filled with warning. Joy could see the officers' expressions shift, just slightly, but they didn't push further. Instead, Officer Martinez cleared his throat, stepping back from the bed. We'll be in touch, he said, his tone now softer. He turned to leave, followed by his partner, but before they could close the door, Adam spoke again, his voice low but filled with authority. Don't think for a second that you can intimidate us into silence. If you're going to investigate, you'd better start with the right people. His eyes locked onto Martinez's, the weight of his words sinking in. You know where I stand. With that, the officers left, the door clicking shut behind them. The tension in the room seemed to lift, but only for a moment. Adam remained in his seat, his eyes trained on the door, lost in thought. Dad? Joy whispered, her voice barely audible. He turned to her, his face softening slightly. I'm not going to let them do this to you, Joy, he said, his voice low but filled with conviction. Not now. Not ever. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken promises, promises of protection, of retribution, of justice. It was clear that Adam was ready to take on anyone who dared to challenge him, no matter the cost. And Joy. She was beginning to understand just how deep the fight was going to get. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but with her father by her side, she knew that she wouldn't face it alone. The shadow behind the curtain. The days that followed felt like a blur to Joy. Her body was still battered from the car crash, and the emotional toll of what had happened seemed to gnaw at her constantly. She spent most of her time in the sterile hospital room, drifting in and out of sleep, the rhythmic beeping of machines providing a constant reminder of the chaos she had narrowly escaped. The painkillers helped dull the ache, but they didn't stop her mind from racing. Ryan was in critical condition, and the doctors had said they were doing everything they could to keep him alive. She couldn't bring herself to visit him again. The shock of the accident, coupled with the devastating truth about his reckless driving and drug use, was too much. It was all too complicated, and the weight of it was crushing her. But there was another weight, one that was steadily growing in the back of her mind, a feeling that her father's presence at her side wasn't just about protecting her from the immediate aftermath of the crash. There was something bigger, darker, moving beneath the surface. She could see it in Adam's eyes, hear it in his calm yet deliberate tone. He was preparing for something, something that went beyond simply getting her out of the hospital and making sure she was okay. Joy knew her father well. She had grown up with his larger-than-life persona, the legend that surrounded him in the biker world. But even that had always seemed like a distant part of him, something she respected, but never fully understood. Now, as she lay in her hospital bed, she was beginning to see just how deep his influence ran, and how far he was willing to go to protect his family. For the first time, she wondered if she really knew the full extent of what her father was capable of. The room was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of paper or the soft murmur of the nurses as they passed through. The sunlight streaming through the blinds cast long shadows on the floor, and for a moment, Joy allowed herself to close her eyes and just breathe, trying to push aside the fear and confusion that had taken over her life. It was then that the door to her room opened, and Adam stepped inside, his face unreadable. He had been in and out of meetings with lawyers, people she didn't know, arranging things that were beyond her comprehension. He had been a constant presence by her side, but this time, as he entered, there was something different about him. A quiet intensity that made her stomach twist. "Dad?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the silence. "What's going on? You've been so distant. What are you planning?" Adam didn't sit down immediately. He stood in front of the window, his back to her, his posture rigid, as if he were holding something back. His eyes were narrowed as he gazed out, watching the world beyond the glass. "I'm doing what needs to be done," he said finally, his voice low and controlled, but there was an undercurrent of something darker beneath his words. "You were right. The system doesn't work for people like us. You saw it with Calloway, the way he treated you. The way they all treat us." Joy felt a knot tighten in her chest. "What are you talking about? Are you saying Dr. Calloway meant to hurt me?" Adam turned slowly, meeting her gaze. His eyes, usually warm and full of love, were now filled with a cold determination. "No, not just him. But he's a part of it. You think he's the only one in that hospital who's been running a little side game, making a profit off of people like you? Off of families like ours?" The weight of his words settled into her bones. She wanted to ask more, to demand that he explain everything, but she couldn't find the words. She could feel the anger radiating from him, but it wasn't directed at her, it was directed at something else, something she wasn't fully able to grasp. "I don't understand," Joy whispered, her voice breaking. "What are you saying, Dad?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped forward and pulled up a chair next to her bed. His hand rested gently on hers, his grip firm but comforting. "Everything's been set in motion, sweetheart," he said, his voice softer now, almost reassuring. I've got people looking into Callaway, into the hospital, into everything. They've been doing it for years, and it's time someone stood up to them. Joy's heart pounded in her chest as the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to fall into place. Her father had been preparing for something monumental, something that had been building behind the scenes for a long time. She didn't know what exactly it was, but she knew it involved more than just her accident. It involved an entire system that had been exploiting people like her, and her father was determined to bring it down. "But why me?" she asked, her voice a mere whisper. "Why is this happening now? What did I do?" Adam's hand tightened around hers. "You didn't do anything, Joy. It's not about what you did. It's about what they've been doing to people who don't have a voice. They think they can walk all over us, because we're easy targets. But they don't know who they're messing with." Joy's mind raced. Her father wasn't just angry at the doctor, at the hospital. This was bigger than that. It was about a whole network of corruption, exploitation, and racism, a system that had been running unchecked for years, and Adam Carter was about to tear it apart. "Dad, I don't know if I can handle this," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can deal with everything you're telling me. I'm just a kid. I don't understand." Adam's eyes softened as he squeezed her hand. "You don't need to understand everything, sweetheart. You just need to know that I'm doing this for you. For us. For everyone who's been mistreated, taken advantage of, or thrown aside because of who they are." Joy stared at him, her emotions a mix of awe and fear. She had always known her father was someone to be respected, even feared. But she had never truly understood just how deep his loyalty ran, how far he was willing to go to protect the ones he loved. "And when this is over, will things go back to normal?" she asked quietly, her voice almost pleading. Adam's expression softened for a moment, but only for a moment. "Things will never go back to the way they were, Joy," he said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of finality. "Once you expose the truth, you can't unsee it. But we can change things. We can make sure no one ever has to go through what you went through again." Before Joy could respond, the door to her room opened again. This time, it wasn't a nurse or another officer. It was a man she had never seen before, wearing a black suit and carrying a briefcase. His eyes were cold, calculating, and when he stepped into the room, it was as if the temperature dropped several degrees. "Mr. Carter," the man said, his voice smooth but firm. "I'm here to discuss the next steps in your case. We need to move quickly." Adam rose to his feet, his expression hardening. He glanced at Joy, his gaze softening only for a moment, before he turned back to the man. "Right," Adam said, his voice steady. "Let's get to work." As the man set down the briefcase and began pulling out papers, Joy realized that everything she had known about her father was about to change. She had known he was powerful, but this was something entirely different. The wheels were already in motion. The fight for justice, for truth, had begun. And Joy was no longer just a passive participant. She was going to be part of something much bigger, a battle for a future where people like her didn't have to live in the shadows of prejudice and inequality. The awakening. Joy had never imagined a life like this, one where every moment felt as though it was poised on the edge of a precipice, a life where her father's looming presence was not just a shield, but a force that could dismantle systems. The days blurred into each other, and while her body was slowly healing from the crash, her mind was being pulled into a world she hadn't asked for, a world filled with shadows and secrets, where every conversation seemed to carry weight, every action had consequence. The man who had walked into her room, the one dressed in the black suit, was named Andrew Collins. He was a lawyer, Adam had explained shortly after the man left the room. Not just any lawyer, but someone who had been dealing with the dirty side of the city's medical industry for years. Collins had an air of quiet authority, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to get things done. He spoke in short, deliberate sentences, and Joy could tell that everything he said was carefully calculated. After Collins left, Adam had sat down beside her again, his gaze never leaving the door, as if he were still expecting more from this world that had, until recently, seemed so simple to her. She wanted to ask him everything. What was he planning? What was his next move? But every time she opened her mouth, the questions tangled in her throat. "Dad," she finally said, her voice unsteady, "is this really what you want for me? For us? To fight a whole system?" Adam turned to face her, his face softened only slightly by the concern he couldn't hide. "You didn't ask for any of this, Joy. But I can't sit back and watch people hurt my family and get away with it. You'll understand, soon enough." Her father's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of all that was at stake. Her life, once simple, now felt complicated, as if the world she had known, one filled with private schools, luxury cars, and family vacations, had crumbled beneath her feet. A few days later, after a series of quiet meetings and whispered conversations, Adam finally filled her in on the full extent of what he was about to do. It was a conversation that would change the course of her life. It started like any other conversation, with Adam seated next to her bed, the early morning sunlight filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. Joy had been staring at the ceiling, her mind still swirling with questions she wasn't ready to ask. She had stopped crying, stopped being angry. She felt resigned, like she was watching a storm gather but wasn't sure if she was in the eye or on the outer edge. "Collins is moving fast," Adam said, his voice steady. "The hospital doesn't know it yet, but they're about to get a shock. They've been playing dirty for too long, and I'm done letting them hide their secrets." Joy sat up a little straighter in her bed, instinctively sensing the gravity of what her father was about to say. "What exactly are you doing, Dad?" Adam looked at her, his expression fierce. "I'm going after the people who made this happen. I'm going after Calloway, after the whole network of people who've been using their positions to take advantage of vulnerable families. I've got information that'll bring it all down." Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, information?" Adam leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Collins has been gathering intel on the hospital for months. There's a whole underground operation we're going to expose. Calloway isn't just some random doctor, he's part of a system that uses people like you, like us, for profit. From overcharging for procedures to pushing unnecessary treatments on patients to make money. But it gets worse. They've been manipulating insurance companies and making deals under the table to line their pockets. And it's not just the doctors. It's the whole network, the administrators, the lawyers, even some of the cops. They've been covering it up for years." Joy's head was spinning as her father spoke. She had no idea what to say, but a cold feeling spread in her chest. She had known the world wasn't perfect, but she hadn't realized how deep the rot went. It wasn't just Calloway. It wasn't just the hospital. It was a whole industry that had built its foundation on exploitation. "How are we going to do this?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and awe. Adam stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline as if the answers were written in the skyline's sharp edges. "We go public. We release everything. The evidence Collins has been gathering is irrefutable. But there's one more thing we need." Joy's heart skipped a beat. "What's that?" He turned back to her, his eyes darker now, filled with a quiet determination. "We need the truth. And the truth comes from people who've been silent for far too long. We need witnesses, nurses, patients, even former employees. People who have seen what's going on and are afraid to speak up. I'm going to give them a voice." Joy shivered. She had always known her father was a force to be reckoned with, but this felt different. This wasn't just a father protecting his daughter, this was a man on a mission to tear down something far bigger than the hospital. It was as if a light had been turned on in her mind, revealing the web of corruption that had been silently suffocating so many for so long. "Are you sure you want to do this, Dad?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I mean, what if it backfires? What if they come after us? Adam's eyes were unwavering, his expression resolute. It's already backfired, sweetheart. It's already been hurting people for years. If I don't do this, who will? For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of his words settled between them, heavy and full of consequence. Joy could feel the enormity of the situation pressing down on her. Her father wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for a new kind of world, a world where people didn't have to suffer in silence, where families like hers didn't have to hide their truth behind closed doors. Later that evening, as Adam walked out of the room, Joy couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something big. She wasn't just going to be a bystander in this fight. She was already part of it. And as terrifying as it was, she knew she was ready. The next day, everything changed. The hospital had become a battleground, but it was one that no one could see. Adam had set the wheels in motion, and now it was time to pull the trigger. He had gone to great lengths to secure the evidence, and Collins was ready to go public with everything they had. But Joy had no idea how fast things would move after that moment. The quiet whispers in the hallways, the covert meetings in dark corners, soon they would burst into the open. And when they did, there would be no going back. As Adam prepared to launch the final phase of his plan, the network of corruption that had been operating unchecked for so long was about to face its reckoning. But it wasn't just the doctors and administrators who would be exposed, it was the entire system that had allowed them to continue unchecked, one that had silently crushed the lives of so many. Joy wasn't sure she was ready for the storm that was about to hit, but one thing was certain, she wasn't going to back down. The reckoning. The day of reckoning had arrived, and Joy's world, once so predictable, had shifted into something unrecognizable. The hospital that had been a place of healing, a refuge of white coats and sterile floors, had turned into a battlefield. But unlike the controlled chaos of a war zone, this battle was fought with truth, documents, and raw, undeniable power. And in the center of it all was Adam Carter, the man she had always known as her father, but who now seemed to have become a figure that could bring down empires. Joy sat in the hospital room, the blinds drawn to block out the sunlight that had once filled the room with warmth. The harsh fluorescent lights above buzzed incessantly, casting an almost clinical glow over everything. She had never felt more detached from reality. The sound of her own heartbeat echoed in her ears, louder than the beeping of the monitors and the distant murmur of voices in the hallway. The weight of her father's plan pressed heavily on her shoulders, and as she sat there, her thoughts circled in a dizzying spiral of fear, uncertainty, and, surprisingly, exhilaration. Adam had gone to great lengths to prepare for this day, gathering allies and forming a quiet network of people who had witnessed the corruption within the hospital. Some were employees who had seen the dark underbelly of the institution firsthand, while others were former patients who had suffered at the hands of those who took advantage of their vulnerabilities. There was no longer any room for hesitation. Every piece of evidence, every person willing to stand up and speak out, had been collected. And now, it was time to bring it all into the light. Joy's father had made it clear that he wasn't just going after the hospital or Dr. Calloway. No, this was bigger. It was about systemic injustice. It was about the way institutions used power and money to manipulate and exploit people who had no way of defending themselves. It was about revenge, not just for her, not just for the countless victims of the hospital, but for anyone who had ever been silenced. Joy didn't fully understand all the details. The world her father was now navigating was one of corruption, deals made in backrooms, and hidden power structures that she had no idea existed. But what she did understand was the feeling of determination that now coursed through her veins. Her father had set a course, and she was no longer a passive participant. She was in this fight, whether she was ready or not. The door to her room creaked open, and for the first time in days, Joy didn't look up immediately. She had become used to the steady parade of nurses, doctors, and even the occasional officer, all moving in and out of her space, as if she were a character in someone else's story. But this time, she sensed a shift. This time, it was different. Adam stepped inside, his face hard as granite, yet his eyes softened as they locked onto her. There was a moment of silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, filled with the weight of everything that was about to unfold. "I've given them the final piece," Adam said, his voice quiet but filled with an underlying current of power. He didn't need to elaborate. Joy knew exactly what he meant. The evidence had been submitted. The witnesses had been gathered. The stage was set. Joy's heart skipped a beat. "And what now?" "Now we wait," Adam said. "The press will be here soon. Once they get wind of what's happening, the whole hospital will be exposed. Calloway won't know what hit him." Joy's stomach churned with nervous energy. She had thought that once the pieces were in motion, she would feel a sense of relief. But instead, she felt the growing weight of anticipation, the kind that settled deep into her bones, making every moment feel like an eternity. This wasn't a game. It wasn't a show. This was real. And once everything was out in the open, there would be no turning back. Her father's words hung in the air as they settled into a charged silence. She knew what was at stake, and she understood the risk her father was taking. He wasn't just challenging the corrupt forces within the hospital. He was challenging a system that had allowed people like him, like her, to be pushed aside for far too long. And once the truth came to light, there would be no escaping the fallout. The tension in the room shifted when a knock echoed from the hallway. The door opened again, and this time it wasn't just Collins. It was the first of the reporters Adam had lined up, people who had been waiting for this moment, poised and ready to cover the story of a lifetime. The world was about to witness the unraveling of a powerful institution. Joy watched as Adam nodded to the reporters, his demeanor calm, as though everything was under control. But she could see it in his eyes. The years of fighting, of silence, had all led to this moment. He wasn't just exposing the truth, he was demanding accountability. As the reporters set up their cameras and microphones, Joy felt a surge of pride for her father. He had always been a man of action. He had always fought for what he believed in. But now, he was fighting for something greater than his own beliefs. He was fighting for justice, for the people who had been wronged, for the people who didn't have a voice. The reporters began asking questions, their voices steady but filled with the hunger for the truth. Adam's responses were deliberate and controlled, but Joy could see the fire behind his words. He spoke of systemic corruption, of the abuse of power by doctors and administrators, of a network that used people like her and her family as pawns in a game they didn't even realize they were part of. Every question posed by the reporters was met with an answer that only dug deeper into the hospital's rot. Adam didn't just answer the questions, he used them as a platform, a stage on which he could expose the truth for all to see. He didn't shy away from the uncomfortable details. He didn't hesitate when asked about the illegal activities, the bribery, the malpractice. He laid it all out, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to hide. As the press conference continued, Joy found herself no longer just an observer. She was part of this story now. Her father's fight was her fight. And as the world watched, she knew this wasn't just about the hospital. It was about something bigger. It was about reclaiming power, about taking a stand against an unjust system that had been allowed to thrive unchecked for too long. And then, just as the last question was asked, Adam turned to Joy, his gaze piercing through her. There was no hint of doubt, no hesitation. "It's over," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "They'll never get away with it again." Joy couldn't help but feel a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief, pride, and even fear. Her father had done it. He had exposed the truth, and the world was about to see the hospital crumble under the weight of its own lies. The reporters packed up, and the room grew quiet once again. Adam stood tall, his back straight, his eyes burning with the fire of someone who had just set the world on a new course. Joy stood slowly, her legs still weak from the accident but her heart filled with newfound strength. She walked over to her father and wrapped her arms around him. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." Adam didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, holding her, his grip firm. "It's not over yet, Joy. But we've started something. And now we finish it."